Imagine a tool that can help you deal with your database migrations, query your data, deal with complex relational data, automatically generate types for your data in TypeScript, and on top of all of that, actually give you a GUI that lets you view your data. A tool like that actually exists, and it's called Prisma. Let's take a look at this tool together. So in order for us to actually play around with Prisma, what we're going to do is we're going to build a very simple job board type website. So in other words, we're going to have really just two main entities, two models. We're going to have one model called companies and then one model called job listings. And the relationship between them is, of course, one company can have multiple job listings. And that'll basically give us that relational data so we can actually show off how easy Prisma makes it for us to actually set up the migrations, but more importantly, to actually deal with our relational data. Okay, so I just created a new folder called job board. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say npm init-y. That's going to go ahead and start up a new node project for myself. Okay, so as you can see, I've now run npm init-y. I have a package JSON that's been created for me. Now I can go ahead and start installing some of the dependencies that I'm going to need in order for myself to be able to work with Prisma. Okay, so here you can see I'm installing Prisma, TypeScript, TS node, add types node, and I'm going to save all of them as dev dependencies. Okay, so now because we're using TypeScript, we're going to need a tsconfig file. So let's go ahead and create that now. So as you can see, I'm now doing touch tsconfig.json. This is how I'm going to go ahead and create that tsconfig file. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and pop in these compiler options into my tsconfig.json. And then with that, the actual setup of our TypeScript part of this application is done. And now we're ready to start moving into the Prisma part of this application. So now back in our terminal, we're now going to go ahead and run npx prisma init. This is going to go ahead and instantiate a new Prisma project. So now that we've actually run the init command, if we look in our directory, we can now see that a few more things were created for us. Number one, we can see that we now have a .env file, which was created for us by this init command. But more importantly, we can also see that we have this Prisma folder, and then inside of it is a file called schema.prisma. Now you notice that my Prisma file actually has some nice coloring and some nice syntax highlighting. That's because I actually installed the Prisma plugin for VS Code. So all you got to do is go here to your extensions, search for Prisma, and then go ahead and install that. Once you install that, you're also going to have the nice syntax highlighting for yourself in the Prisma file. So now one of the first things that you typically do inside of your Prisma file is you actually set up your database connection string. So you'll see here that they're referencing this database URL that was created for us inside of our .env file. So here you can see there's a variable called database URL, which references a Postgres connection string. And so the sort of initial boilerplate that they give you assumes that you're going to be working with Postgres. Now, if you're working with Postgres, that's perfect, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to try to keep it even simpler, and we're going to be using SQLite. So we're going to tweak our setup just a little bit to actually give it a SQLite connection string, which is of course nothing more than the path to our database file. Okay, so now you can see that I'm essentially saying that my provider is going to be SQLite, and the URL is going to be file./dev.db. Essentially, I'm telling it that there's going to be a file right here in the same directory, pretty much right relative to this exact file that we're in right now. There's going to be a file called dev.db, which is going to be my SQLite database. So let me go ahead and create that file now. Okay, so now you can see I've actually created my dev.db file. It's right there, and this is exactly what we're referencing inside of our Prisma file. Now we're ready to move on to the next step of our configuration. So now that we have our database connection configuration taken care of, we're finally ready to start working on the models that we're going to have within our database. So the structure for us again is going to be that we're going to have a model of companies, a table of companies, and then we're going to have a table of job listings, and the relationship is a one-to-many relationship where every company can have multiple job listings. So let's see how we actually set this up using Prisma. Here you can see I've got my company model. I give it all the standard stuff of ID and then the timestamps of when it was created, updated, so on and so forth. I'm give it a name, a website. All that is not very exciting. Here you can see the second column is where you give it the data type. The third column is if you want to kind of give it some kind of, modifiers. So for example, here I'm going to go ahead and say that this is going to be my ID that's going to auto increment. Here, the created at and the updated at are going to be timestamps. And then here, these don't have any modifiers. But the one is actually, and all of this can be found within the Prisma documentation, which is why I'm kind of glossing over it, because while they are kind of Prisma specific in the way that you write them, at the end of the day, it's mostly just database stuff that you're already very familiar with if you've written any kind of SQL in the past. But the part that's actually very interesting here is this job listings key. So job listings is not going to actually be a key that's going to exist within our database, within the model of company. Instead, this is how we're going to be teaching Prisma about the fact that we're going to have a relationship where every company can have multiple job listings. And the data type that we're giving it is we're saying it's going to be an array of this job listings model that exists right over here. So we're going to have another model called job listing, which again has all the sort of standard stuff, the ID, the timestamps of updated and created, description, allows remote, blah, blah, blah. And then we of course give it a company ID, which is just the standard relational data stuff. So in other words, job listing is going to have a company ID telling it which company it belongs to. But then the really cool part is we then come down here and we say that a job listing also has on it a company. So the same way that the company had a job listings, which basically said that for every company you could have multiple job listings, every job listing can have one company. And here's where we actually teach it how the relationship is going to work. So we're saying that it's going to relate back to the company. How? We're going to use the company ID field that we have on the job listing, and that's going to reference the ID field that we have back on the company. So now while we do in fact have all of our setup and configuration taken care of, what we don't yet have is our database actually set up with this. In other words, right now this just exists within our Prisma file, but we haven't actually done anything to take this and transform it into the SQL, into the database migrations to actually go into our database. So let's take care of that now. So for that, we're going to be running the following command. Back in my terminal, we're going to go ahead and say npx prisma migrate dev -- name init. So what this is going to do is this is actually going to go ahead and create a migration file. And then what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and run that migration file all with just one command. So now that we ran the command, if we come back into our code base, you can see that we have inside of the Prisma folder, we have a new folder called migrations. And as you can see, the migration that we just created is sitting right here. This is the SQL that was generated for us by Prisma. And besides for just generating the SQL, Prisma now also ran the SQL against our database, which means that if we actually take a look at our database, we're now going to see that we do in fact have the company table as well as the job listing table. So let me show you that. So this is now going to also introduce us to the next very cool concept about Prisma, is that it actually has something called the Prisma Studio, which is a UI that we can use directly within the browser to view our data, which I think is awesome. The command to actually get the studio up and running is nothing more than npx prisma studio. Now if we head on over to the browser and we go over to localhost 5555, you can see here that we have our UI, our GUI that was actually generated for us by Prisma. You can see it's giving us a list of our models. We've got the company model as well as the job listing model. And for example, if we go into the company model, you can see that all of our fields are right there. We've got our ID, we've got the created at, the updated at, and so on and so forth. So finally, our boilerplate and configuration is done. Our database is set up and we're ready to start building our application. So let's start writing some code. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and install Express so we can build out a simple little API for our job board application. Here you can see I'm installing Express and then of course the types to go along with it. So the first thing I did was I went ahead and I created a simple server.ts file. This is me doing nothing more than the basic boilerplate setup for an Express application. I'm importing Express, creating an app instance. I'm using the express.json middleware so that I can be able to parse the incoming JSON body. And then I'm telling Express to listen on port to 1337. Nothing exciting right now happening in this file. But if we move on over to the companies.ts file, here we can start to see that we're going to be making use of this Prisma client. So before we actually take any step further, the first thing that we're going to need to do is actually install the Prisma client. So to do that, we're going to go back to the terminal and we're going to run this command, npm install @prisma/client. So now that we actually have the Prisma client installed, let's see how we use it. So here you can see I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to import the Prisma client from @prisma client. I'm going to instantiate a new instance of Prisma by calling the new Prisma client constructor. This is some basic Express stuff. I'm going to go ahead and set up a router. So here now you can see we have our first endpoint. We're going to be making a post request, and within this endpoint, we're going to go ahead and create a new company. So let's see how we do this. So here you can see we're going to say const company is equal to await prisma.company. So you can already see that on this Prisma object, we have a key called company. So let me actually show you why that's so cool. I can now do Prisma, and I can either do company, or I can do .job listing. It's giving me both of those options. It knows that both of those options exist, and all of that's just because I actually went ahead and defined my models here. Inside of my schema.prisma, I defined that I have a company and a job listing. Now on my instance of Prisma, it now knows that I have a job listing and that I have a company. Furthermore, I can actually now import an interface, a TypeScript interface called company, and a TypeScript interface called job listing. And all this was created and made available to me by Prisma. So I get all this sort of fancy TypeScript code completion and help just out of the box because I went ahead and defined my models inside of the schema.prisma file. Really, really nice stuff. Now here's another thing that's actually very cool about Prisma. If we actually take a look at the post request, you can see that I'm very simply doing prisma.company.create. Create is going to accept an object, and then there's a key called data. And right now that data is just equal to rect.body. So this is me not really getting a chance to highlight the beauty of Prisma. Let me show you something. If instead of me just doing rect.body, I wanted to actually very specifically set up my object that I'm going to be creating this company with, watch what I can do. I can go ahead and say that data is going to be equal to an object. And now if I do Control Space, you can see that it's already giving me my IntelliSense directly within my VS Code editor of exactly which fields are available on my company object and which ones are required and which ones are not. Again, I never even went ahead and created an interface for a company. It knows about all of this simply because I went ahead and defined all of this inside of my schema.prisma. But for now, we're just going to keep this as rec.body because we're literally going to be sending in the body that we need. So there's no reason not to do rec.body, but I was simply trying to highlight the fact that Prisma actually is able to give us the IntelliSense that we need right out of the box. So the next endpoint that we have defined within this file is going to be our GET request. So here you can see we're saying await prisma.company.find many. And now here you can see we're saying include job listings true. Now, if you remember, the relationship that we have, the way that our database is set up is we have a company that has a one-to-many relationship with job listings. For every company, there can be many job listings. Now, instead of me having to go write some kind of SQL to actually query the database to get the company with all of its corresponding job listings, Prisma is just going to do that for me automatically, act like an ORM, because that's exactly what it is. I can simply tell Prisma, go ahead and find me all of my companies, and I want you to include all of the company's job listings with them. So now I'm just going to get a simple object that's going to have every company, and for every company is going to be a key on it called job listing, which is going to be an array of job listings that are related to that particular company. So we're going to see this soon once we actually run the code. I just want to first show you what it all looks like. So perfect. So far, we've actually given us the opportunity to create a company and to query all the companies along with their job listings. But now we actually have to go and create a router that we can use to actually query and add our job listings. So let's do that now. So here now in the job listings file, a lot of this should already look very familiar to you because it's very similar to what we just did inside of the companies file. So again, we're going to instantiate our instance of Prisma. We're going to be creating a router. We're going to have a post request that's going to allow us to go ahead and create a job listing. But here are the possible values that we can create are going to be different. So let me show you that. If let's say I didn't want to use rec.body, but I wanted to go ahead and create my own object. If I do Control Space, now you can see that we're getting a different set of fields. We're getting allows remote, description, company, so on and so forth. It knows exactly what the job listing needs. And that's for the same reason why it knew what it needed for the company. Again, this is all because Prisma is able to automatically create this based off of the prisma.schema file. And then finally, we have our GET request, which is doing nothing more than giving us back all of our job listings. So now we just have one last bit of setup that we need to do before we actually get to run this code. So let's take care of that. So back in my server.ts file, you can see that all I've actually done is I've imported the company router from the companies file. I've imported the job router from the job listings file. And now I'm telling Express that if somebody goes to /API/companies, use the company router. And so too, if somebody goes to /API/jobs, go to the job router. So with all that out of the way, we're finally ready to run this code. So now back in the terminal to run this code, all we're going to do is we're going to say npx tsnode server.ts. Okay, now as you can see, our server is running on port 1337. Now, of course, if you want to, you can just use Postman to run this API. But I recently learned about this thing called Thunder Client, which you can use directly inside of your VS Code to actually make API requests to your server. So I'm going to use that. Okay, so now you can see that I'm inside of my Thunder client, and I'm going to say that I'm making a post request to localhost 1337/API/companies, and then in the body, I'm going to be sending in an object that's going to have a name, a website, and a description. So let's go ahead and run this and see whether or not we do in fact create our company. So we hit send. As you can see, we actually have a company object that was created for us, but more importantly, let's go back to our Prisma Studio and see if we can see this inside of our Prisma Studio. So here now you can see that I'm in my Prisma Studio, I'm under the company model, and you can see that I do in fact have my object right over here. You can see it's got the timestamps, it's got the name, the website, the description, it's all there, but of course this particular company does not yet have any job listings. So let's change that. Okay, so now you can see that I'm making a post request to localhost 1337/API/jobs. The job that I'm actually sending in is going to have the allows remote set to true. The company ID is going to be equal to 1 to the company ID that we just created. And then, of course, the description is just going to be edit videos. So now once I hit send, you can see that an object, a company object, was actually created for us. Going back into our studio, you can now see that our job listings, which was previously set to 0, was now set to 1. And we do actually have a job listing right over here, this exact one that we just created. Now let's go back to our Thunder client. Let's now go ahead and query all of our companies, and it's going to include the job listings with it. And I want you to see how it's going to actually come back. It's going to come back as an object of a company. It's going to have a key on it called job listings, which is itself going to be an array of all of our job listings. Let's see that. So here I am now making a GET request to the /API/companies endpoint. I'm going to hit send. And here you can see I've got my company. I've got the job listings array, which is going to have the one job listing that we just created that we set to this particular company that we had created previously. Well, that does it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like. It really helps the channel, and I'll catch you in the next one.